Well, hey people, we're so glad that you're joining us. This is an edition of our deep dive, week 2 of our Love Where You Live series. And Chris Vance, our St. Charles campus pastor, is here. We're missing Brad. It feels really kind of empty. We're so used to having Brad, and he's on a well-deserved vacation this week.
We just locked him out of the broadcast room. That's what happened.
There you go. He helped create it.
Yes.
We hope he's home loving his neighbor. We hope he's doing something, or maybe having a neighbor over to do a project in their house. But we miss Brad, but we're here, and we want to just continue the deep dives looking at neighboring. And this week, we kind of just invited people to take a walk through their neighborhood and take a walk. Jesus taking a walk. Chris, what's your neighborhood like?
Yeah. So my neighborhood is very subdivision-like. There's a bunch of houses on a street, and we're in pretty close proximity to each other. So it's not super spread out. So there's quite a bit of like conversation and contact, and even if it's just getting the mail or mowing the grass, there's a lot of in-between casual small talk conversations that are cherished for sure.
You know, one thing I noticed in our neighborhood is the sidewalk is on the opposite side of the street.
Okay.
So people don't walk on our side. They don't walk close. They walk on the other side. And, there's power in sidewalks, I think, of just being, people are there. I noticed it Halloween when people are trick-or-treating, they're naturally walking the sidewalk on the other side. And so you really have to be much more intentional about neighboring or seeing people when they're not they're not really right there on your property.
Yeah, we don't even have sidewalks. We just walk down the street. And so, it's just whatever people choose. But we do have a lot of dog walkers in our neighborhood. Right. I would say Haley and I have met like 80% of the neighbors we know through walking Lila, our dog. And then, we have like puppy play dates or whatever. We'll let them come in our backyard and they'll run around. So, we are a strong dog walking neighborhood.
We know our neighbors because we have a little small dog, 14 pounds, who thinks he's a gigantic dog and attacks every dog who comes out. So we meet their neighbors because our dog thinks he can beat up their dog.
Good.
So we got to meet a few people.
Yeah.
Well, Jesus takes us through his neighborhood. I mean, I do think Matthew 9 is really fascinating when you look at that. It begins with him jumping off kind of the boat into Capernaum and stepping out of there and seeing. And this is what we see is Capernaum. Jesus stepped onto a boat, Matthew 9:1, crossed over and came to his own town. Some people brought to him a paralyzed man lying on a mat. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the man, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." And at this, some of the teachers of the law said to themselves, "This fellow is blaspheming." But knowing their thoughts, Jesus said, "Why do you entertain evil thoughts in your heart?" And then he says to the paralyzed man, "Get up, take your mat, go home." And the man did it. And so I think all throughout the passage, one of the things we tried to look at was just Jesus seeing people. And what does that passage speak to you about what Jesus sees in his neighbors?
Yeah. So something that always impresses me about Jesus and also impresses me about the New Testament church in Acts is that despite a massively successful ministry and some amount of like local fame, they still see the people that are on the fringes of society. Like they still see the neighbors who don't have a ton to maybe offer them, financially or social status wise. And yet they're constantly seeing the paralytics, the lepers, the children, the people that aren't necessarily the upper crust of society. And yet, even though they're very transient and often in Jesus's ministry, they're like traveling to a place, they're coming, they're going, and yet they're seeing these people, but they're not just physically seeing them, they're seeing the need. I think that's what's key. It's not just I see you, smile and wave. Even though the smile and wave is important, it says I see you physically, I'm not ignoring you. But it's also like, what is your need? I think that's key.
And what's interesting to me is when you look at Jesus taking a walk in his neighborhood. Yeah. This was not his first rodeo in Capernaum. No. He had been there. Like, did he know this man on the side of the road? Was this man a regular, person asking for alms? Not a lot of names are always given. Did Jesus know about it? Had he seen him before? Or the other, was he from out of town, brought there? And that's what I was thinking. In this situation, there's something about this man's story that Jesus knows. Like, no other time does he say to the leper or anybody else, well, your sins need to be forgiven, which is universal to all of us. But this guy, and that's what it always makes me wonder, did Jesus know a greater need in this guy for his sins to be forgiven?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good reminder that Jesus has locality. Like, he grew up in a place. I was thinking about this the other day. Like, Jesus had neighbors as a toddler, as a child, as a teenager that, like, saw Jesus take, like, early steps and saw him, like, grow up. And, I don't know in Jesus's house if they had the little, like, height, little pencil marks on the doorpost, like, what does that look like in the first century? But whatever the equivalent of that is, like, neighbors saw him physically grow up. Like, he belonged to a place, yes, triune God of the universe, but here he is in Capernaum in the Galilee region, living amongst people.
Yeah. And knowing just their life. Like, that's what I think. He wasn't just a stranger who would come in, but I'm sure he'd have conversations. He'd know people. People would know him, and he took time, obviously, to get to know their life and their story, which I think really just speak, how much of my neighbor's stories do I know? How much of their background, what they've gone through?
Yeah.
I think it's we moved here 12 years ago now, and that's one of the hardest points, I think, of moving to a place is no one knows your real story. And I had almost 50 years of story, of life and experiences that nobody knew. And so you don't feel as known. It just takes a while for people to know that. And it makes me think my other neighbors, people who move in, they've got a whole story and background in life that we don't get to see or experience. Yeah.
And I think also, we see Jesus and his disciples, they're constantly, it seems like, on the move in a lot of ways. And I think in a different way, but in a similar way, it's true for us. Like, we're constantly on the move. Like, even for those of us who maybe didn't, like, move here from Canada, right? That have been here a long time. It's like we hobby over here, we work over here. Maybe you take your kids to sports over here, you get your haircut here. Like, there's all these, it's a very commuter city. It's very spread out, St. Charles County is. And so I think there's always the challenge of being everywhere and being nowhere. It's like, okay, we're everywhere, we might be seen, but it's like we have so many places that we're spreading ourselves pretty thin. Maybe we don't have super deep-rooted relationships in a few places that we need to.
Maybe in your family they don't watch Hallmark movies, but Hallmark movies play a lot in our home, and it's often the woman typically, but a couple from the big city, someone from the big city has to go home to their small community in the idyllic little town. And they realize, they've got a history and a past and a story and neighbors and people who love them, and they're so drawn to that. They don't like the anonymity of a larger place, and they're drawn to that. And I think almost Hallmark has captured something that's probably deep in our heart.
Just speaking to, like, millennials and Gen Z, like, more my age category, like, I think the sexy thing to do is to move, like, to be transient, to have all these different experiences, because there is a certain level of kind of like FOMO of, oh, I want to move to the beach, I want to move to the mountains, like, whatever.
Well, I see the Instagram picture. I want to be there too.
And so I don't know. I think we miss a value of being known, being loved, being seen, like, pouring into and also being loved by a community for 10, 20, 30 years. Like, that reclaiming locality, I think, will be a pretty important thing for us.
And which obviously in a larger town, I mean, it's your neighborhood most likely, and I think that's why essentially church has played that, I think, for a time, right, where people maybe connect to a church and a community there that they're known, and maybe as people are more de-churched and the church is taking a less common role, people are looking at other ways doing that.
And I think the suburbs are especially tough. Like, in rural communities, for better or worse, you pretty much know everyone. And then in urban settings, like, you might have your community niche that has like a strong flavor of whatever part of city. But in the suburbs, we're driving everywhere. We're spread out, right? It's in our garage. Shut the garage door quick. So I do think we have to push back against that to enter into those deeper friendships and relationships of staying put a little bit.
Yeah. So Jesus and well, Matthew does in his writing, he kind of talks about himself. He goes on in verse 9. It says, as Jesus went from there, kind of the man who healed, he saw a man named Matthew, which was him, sitting at a tax collector's booth, and follow me, he told them. And Matthew got up and followed him. And Jesus went from there and saw Matthew. What do you think Jesus saw holistically when he looks at Matthew?
Yeah, it's interesting. He sees a son of Israel ethnically,
Yes, right.
and yet here he is in this role that is very Roman. And to the Jews, this is a very like betrayer, Benedict Arnold kind of role. And so it's beautiful to me that when the other Jews are in passing, I mean, they probably are spitting on this dude. Like they despise Matthew. But Jesus doesn't see necessarily like the role. He sees the heart. He sees the person. He sees Matthew as this guy that's going to become one of his like primary disciples for his 3 years of ministry. So he's looking past the exterior circumstance, which maybe we need to do. Maybe our neighbors have annoyingly parked a massive RV on the street or whatever. Like, we need to look past exterior, like what is the actual need? And I think he sees a need in Matthew that he meets.
I think, we talked about this last fall, I think, in our Knowing Jesus series. And I remember between the disciples, Peter and Andrew, James, John, who had paid money, probably tax money to this guy and everything. I mean, it's like having someone from QAnon and someone from the Squad trying to live next door to each other and be a neighbor. And I think as Jesus is walking us down his street, his neighborhood, he sees the pain in the man that's lame, but he sees something potential or something in Matthew. He sees obviously what they own together, not their differences. Yeah. And I think that's, to me, that's a powerful principle, that Jesus sees the possibility in people, not the differences and the problems. And I think we look at the opposite.
Oh, for sure. Like, I mean, we're still recovering from a pretty anxious election year.
Sure.
It's like, okay, so for your neighbor that puts the sign up in their front yard for the candidate that you're not voting for, it's like you still move towards and love, even though, they're putting their sign in their front yard, and you're like, okay, we're going to have differences, but I'm still called. Like, I'm still placed here. Their address isn't a mistake. My address isn't a mistake. Like, call the neighbor. And I have
to love my neighbor.
Yeah.
There's a great picture in the newspaper, kind of made the waves last fall, because it was a suburb in Pennsylvania, and the one neighbor had the Biden signs, the other neighbor had the Trump sign, and then there was like a third sign that basically said, we still love each other. Like we love each other anyway. Obviously people knew their differences, and you could tell these were real neighbors. They were obviously friends. They knew about each other, but they weren't going to let what their differences were detract from what potential could be.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that Jesus has a disciple that's a zealot and a tax collector, I mean, there's nothing more extreme than that.
Right. Yeah. And I think that just the study of those disciples is so appropriate for our time to understand who that is. Then any tips you have for how do people do that? How do they look beyond the differences? Have you got?
Yeah, I
think that's really hard for people.
I think part of it is going into it knowing that, okay, my physical neighbors aren't maybe in alignment, whether it's like philosophically or politically or even just like hobby. We might not share the same hobbies. Maybe I love sports and they can't stand sports, like whatever. We just have to understand in our physical proximity, it's not a curated environment. Like when we're online, we can curate who our neighbors are.
Right.
When we're choosing our hobbies, we can curate who our friends are. But in your physical neighborhood, unless you're literally buying up every house on the street, you can't curate that.
And people try, don't you see? Everybody on Facebook, come and be my neighbor. I want, I want to be able to choose who my neighbor is.
Yeah. So I think it's that mentality of, I can't curate this. We may have some very real differences. Yeah. And yet, if God has ordained this time and place in this street, then his footprints and his fingerprints go before me. And there may be some awkwardness. I think that's part of the thing. We have to move towards the inconvenience and the awkwardness of, oh, I'm mowing the lawn, my neighbor comes out, they're doing something in their front yard. Stop the lawnmower. Go across the street. Have a small talk conversation. I'll give you a good example. So most people know this, I'm a massive Packers fan. 2 houses down from me, the guy, come football season, will be just wearing all sorts of Chicago Bears paraphernalia. And at first I was like, oh no, here we go. And yet it's like, okay, we both have a dog. Let's start a conversation. Yeah. Maybe our dogs can play together. And hey, even the gospel bridges those rivalries, So yeah.
I think, I think one of the lost things sometimes it's hard in the series is that we focus on us being the good neighbor.
Yeah.
And how do we impact, obviously for Christ, out of loving God, loving our neighbor. But to what degree do we believe God has put those neighbors there for us and our spiritual growth and development? And we want to cancel or get rid sometime or wish for other neighbors. But maybe they are what God's using to really grow us. And I'm sure Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Matthew, I can imagine, I wouldn't want to be Jesus some days trying to manage that. But I think for their own spiritual growth, they needed each other.
Yeah. And this is where prayer is so pivotal because if we're in prayer for those who live in close proximity to us, it is so much harder to either discriminate or have any sort of bias against them for what they believe or what they do if we're in constant prayer for them. I think the Holy Spirit in prayer weeds a lot of that out over time.
Yeah, I hope people have really taken that from last week about really praying for our neighborhood and walking and doing that. So Jesus then, verse 18, kind of he's continuing. It says, while he was saying this, he was preaching, answering some questions. A synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, my daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live. And Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Just then a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him, touched the edge of his cloak. And she said to herself, if I only touch this cloak, I'll be healed. And Jesus turned and saw her. And, I think this is the beauty of scriptures. In an economy of words, every word matters. And Jesus just didn't turn and yell at her or say something to her, but he saw her first. And then he said, take heart, daughter. Your faith has healed you. And the woman was healed at that moment. And so Jesus is seeing, both of these people and I think their hurts. He sees their needs and their hurts. What do you think it felt like for her when Jesus saw her? I think, did they lock eye? I think if Matthew's writing this, he was probably there. He noticed something.
Yeah. So in some ways, approaching Jesus, she probably doesn't want to be seen a whole lot, right? Because of the ceremonial laws, she's trying to be discreet. And yet in that moment, she probably feels the overwhelming amount of being known and loved, of being seen. And then also there's, Jesus is on his way to heal a synagogue leader's daughter. Yeah. Oh, that's the important person. And yet this woman on the fringe,
couldn't go to synagogue. She couldn't go to worship.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jesus is interrupting that work, which is a great work to go and heal that girl. But then he's pausing for the woman. So in the midst of the busyness and even something good, he still pauses for the woman, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah, you're right. Sometimes we don't want to be seen.
Yeah.
Right. We want to, in our own shame and brokenness, we don't want to be seen. Jesus sees us. But there's something powerful when someone says, I see you. Just even words of encouragement, right? When you say, I see you, or I see what you do, or I see how you parent your child, or I see how you treat your spouse, or I see you at work. I think there's something in us that longs to be noticed. And how many people in our neighborhoods are craving that they don't get that. And I think probably too through the pandemic and the isolation, people longing more. Does someone know or see me?
Yeah. Yeah, especially coming out of, as we learn to readjust of, okay, what does life look like after the pandemic? Like, there's going to be a lot of people that haven't seen their friends and family in nearly the capacity, if at all, like compared to other people. Everyone's in a little different space, but I do think that's something we're going to have to navigate is, okay, there are some people feeling some very real effects of isolation.
Right.
Like, COVID's not just a physical thing, it's a mental thing as well. And so how do we move towards love to those who have felt that isolation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He sees this woman, heals her, and then Jesus enters the synagogue's leader's home in verse 23 and saw the noisy crowd and the people playing pipes. And he says, "Go away, the girl's not dead." They laugh at him, but then he heals her.
Yeah.
And it's very specific that he sees these people. He sees the faith. He sees, Matthew, the tax collector. He sees this woman turns. But this time he sees the noisy crowd and the flute players. What do you think he's seeing?
Yeah. Well, I think he's seeing one. So this is culturally normal. So it's not like he's shocked and awed about flute players like being there present at the funeral. Like, they probably would have been hired to do this as a part of the mourning and grieving process. So culturally, it's not an oddity, but also there's a little bit of a shallowness to it, right? Like, they're a hired hand.
Right.
A hired hand would never grieve in the way a family member would. But it just points out again that, like, even in the busyness of what Jesus is doing, he's still taking account and taking note and seeing everyone along the way. So it's like it's a retraining our eyes to see those in which we wouldn't normally because of what Jesus is calling us to.
Yeah, and as you said, that's one of the habits, it's the practice, it's the natural ritual or routine that someone would do in grief. And, I think for me, that's just a reminder. Am I aware of the rituals and routines and practices of people around me? Do I see what they're doing? And I know, we were asking people this week, just to take some notes on your neighbor, even put their birth dates down or an anniversary or something that's meaningful to mark people's with. And I know you've been doing that in your neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. Celebrate what your neighborhood celebrates.
Yeah.
Celebrate where you live celebrates. I mean, as long as you can, right? Like, properly. And so, if it's a birthday, if it's a holiday, if there's some kind of victory, I'm thinking about the Blues Parade a couple years ago, like, celebrate what your city, community, neighborhood celebrates. And in that, you're going to build a lot of relationships, and it's the easy avenue, right? Because it's not you having to be crazy creative and create something out of nothing. It's already there in the schedule for most of our lives, whether it's like Halloween or Christmas or Easter, and we can step into that, and it's a really good avenue. Yeah.
I think it's those things in the differences of our neighborhood that bring us together, right? Because that's, if we only focus on the differences, we'll see each other as enemies almost. Right. But what is it that brings us together so that we have an opportunity to shape and speak truth and share just our lives with people?
Yeah, absolutely.
And birthdays, block parties or 4th of July or whatever, it brings Halloween. It often brings neighborhoods together in some way.
I think the easy thing is to always drift towards either apathy or like non-activity. I think that's the easy thing. The hard thing is always going to be moving towards because it takes the thought, it takes the seeing, it takes the heart of wanting that. So it's always a moving towards, but our God is a God who always is moving towards us. And so we reflect that in always moving towards our neighbors.
Which I think is that summary verse in verse 35 where it says Jesus went through all the towns and villages. So now he's outside his neighborhood, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming good news of the kingdom, healing every disease.
Yeah.
And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless. Like as he saw individuals, he would see people even in the crowds, and he had compassion. And, looking at it from a neighboring perspective, when I look at my neighborhood, what do I see? Or when I drive by neighborhoods, what do I see? Or what do I think? And I think sometimes there's a lot more judgment than compassion.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, everyone has that neighbor that doesn't bring their dog in when they should. And it's, why is your dog barking at 6 a.m.? I'm about to come down there. Y'all driving me crazy, right? Like, everyone has that neighbor that there's something, maybe it's not a dog, but, it's so easy to see, like, their practice or whatever.
Right.
And it's like, okay, but how do we still move towards compassion?
I'm very lucky. Our backyard neighbors, they'll have dogs, and they all treat each other. They're kind of friends. They're fence friends.
Yeah.
The dogs, and people are very respectful. We've been very lucky. I'll say in our neighborhood, we don't. Fortunately, we don't have those dogs.
You haven't got any fights with the neighbors yet?
No, I'm sure they want to fight. I'm like, okay, I gotta mow my lawn today or do something.
Yeah.
But to get it to work, like we've been very good. In fact, I don't know if I'll share this story sometime. I had an awkward conversation just about seeing people as I was mowing my lawn one evening, and there was a couple on the sidewalk the other side of the street, and you could tell that it was early 30s, probably a couple. They were fighting. Like there was a big dispute, and like I stopped my lawnmower because I thought, I think as I said last week, it was safest place. Our prayers to be the safest place.
Yeah.
In our neighborhood, and so I stopped the lawnmower, and I'm like, "Are you okay?" Because I could tell the woman, and this is when I wish my wife had been out there too. But and they were embarrassed, I think, and so they kept on walking, and then so I started mowing my lawn again, and then they're coming back, and it's even worse this time. And I stop, and I'm like, "Are you okay? Do you need a safe place?" And they just kind of took off because they were so embarrassed. But it's sometimes those awkward situations, you see, and I could see, man, these are harassed and helpless couple. And I look back and I think I failed as a neighbor, actually, and not knowing. They were obviously from our neighborhood. But I'm like, I should have done more, something different. How could I have connected differently with them?
And I think, like, neighboring is hard. Like, we're always learning from the should-haves, right?
Yes.
Like Shauna Pilgreen, author of Love Where You Live. Like she said this in an interview we did recently. She said, I'm always learning from the should-haves. If I should have said something, I should have went across the street, I should have stopped my run and talked to them, whatever it is. And so I think we've got to give ourselves a little grace in neighboring, realizing, just naming, it's super hard, and we're always going to be learning from the should-haves.
Right.
And if we're learning from the should-haves, then we're actually going to be growing in our neighboring and our love of our neighbors long term.
Yeah. Well, that's good, and that's Jesus. That starts with really seeing. I mean, I think that's are we praying for our neighbors, and then are we really paying attention to them? I think that's what Jesus does. He's listening, hearing, seeing, paying attention to them. Yeah. So next week, what are we talking about in neighboring?
Yeah, we're talking.
This is the good stuff.
Yeah, we're growing more towards hospitality.
Yeah.
Come on in. Come see our story and the bigger story in which we live.
And let's eat together.
Yeah.
Which we
food. Yes.
Food always brings.
It's a great equalizer.
People together. There's something about that. So, great, Chris. Thanks for joining. This series, I think, has really captured people's heart, and we're just praying it plants a lot of great seeds as people neighbor well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Have a good
on
one,
our
y'all.
deep dive.